of these early days when the members of the prince's staff were repersonalized on Urantia as supermen. The serious obstacle to the good influence of such extraplanetary teachers is the tendency of mortals to regard them as gods, but aside from the technique of their appearance on Earth, the Caligastia 100, 50 men and 50 women, did not resort to supernatural methods nor superhuman manipulations. But the corporeal staff were nonetheless superhuman. They began their mission on Urantia as extraordinary threefold beings. 1. They were corporeal and relatively human, for they embodied the actual life plasm of one of the human races, the andonic life plasm of Urantia. These 100 members of the prince's staff were divided equally as to sex and in accordance with their previous mortal status. Each person of this group was capable of becoming co-parental to some new order of physical being, but they had been carefully instructed to resort to parenthood only under certain conditions. It is customary for the corporeal staff of a planetary prince to procreate their successors sometime prior to retiring from special planetary service. Usually this is at or shortly after the time of the arrival of the planetary Adam and Eve. These special beings, therefore, had little or no idea as to what type of material creature would be produced by their sexual union, and they never did know. Before the time for such a step in the prosecution of their world work, the entire regime was upset by rebellion, and those who later functioned in the parental role had been isolated from the life currents of the system. In skin color and language, these materialized members of Caligastia's staff followed the andonic race. They partook of food as did the mortals of the realm, with this difference. The recreated bodies of this group were fully satisfied by a non-flesh diet. This was one of the considerations which determined their residence in a warm region abounding in fruits and nuts. The practice of subsisting on a non-flesh diet dates from the times of the Caligastia 100, for this custom spread near and far to affect the eating habits of many surrounding tribes, groups of origin in the once exclusively meat-eating evolutionary races. The 100 were material but superhuman beings, having been reconstituted on Urantia as unique men and women of a high and special order. This group, while enjoying provisional citizenship on Jerusalem, were as yet unfused with their thought adjusters, and when they volunteered and were accepted for planetary service in liaison with the descending orders of sonship, their adjusters were detached. But these Jerusalemites were superhuman beings. They possessed souls of ascendant growth. During the mortal life in the flesh, the soul is of embryonic estate. It is born, resurrected, in the Morantia life, and experiences growth through the successive Morantia worlds. And the souls of the Caligastia 100 had thus expanded through the progressive experiences of the 7 mansion worlds to citizenship status on Jerusalem. In conformity to their instructions, the staff did not engage in sexual reproduction, but they did painstakingly study their personal constitutions, and they carefully explored every imaginable phase of intellectual, mind, and Morantia soul liaison. And it was during the 33rd year of their sojourn in Dalmatia, long before the wall was completed, that number 2 and number 7 of the Danite group accidentally discovered a phenomenon attendant upon the liaison of their Morantia selves, supposedly non-sexual and non-material. And the result of this adventure proved to be the first of the primary midway creatures. This new being was wholly visible to the planetary staff and to their celestial associates, but was not visible to the men and women of the various human tribes. Upon authority of the planetary prince, the entire corporeal staff undertook the production of similar beings, and all were successful, following the instructions of the pioneer Danite pair. Thus did the prince's staff eventually bring into being the original core of 50,000 primary midwayers. These mid-type creatures were of great service in carrying on the affairs of the world's headquarters. They were invisible to human beings, but the primitive sojourners at Dalmatia were taught about these unseen semi-spirits, and for ages they constituted the sum total of the spirit world to these evolving mortals. 3. The Caligastia 100 were personally immortal, or undying. There circulated through their material forms the antidotal complements of the life circuits of the system. and had they not lost contact with the life circuits through rebellion, they would have lived on indefinitely until the arrival of a subsequent Son of God, or until their some time later release to resume the interrupted journey to Havona and Paradise. These antidotal complements of the Satania life currents were derived from the fruit of the tree of life, a shrub of Urantia which was sent to Urantia by the Most Highs of Norlatiadec at the time of Caligastia's arrival. In the days of Dalmatia, this tree grew in the central courtyard of the Temple of the Unseen Father, and it was the fruit of the tree of life that enabled the material and otherwise mortal beings of the prince's staff to live on indefinitely as long as they had access to it. While of no value to the evolutionary races, this supersustenance was quite sufficient to confer continuous life upon the Caligastia 100 and also upon the 100 modified Andonites who were associated with them. It should be explained in this connection that, at the time the 100 Andonites contributed their human germ plasm to the members of the prince's staff, the life carriers introduced into their mortal bodies the complement of the system's circuits, and thus were they enabled to live on concurrently with the staff century after century in defiance of physical death. Eventually, the 100 Andonites were made aware of their contribution to the new forms of their superiors, and these same 100 children of the Andon tribes were kept at headquarters as the personal attendants of the prince's corporeal staff. 5. Organization of the 100. The 100 were organized for service in 10 autonomous councils of 10 members each. When 2 or more of these 10 councils met in joint session, such liaison gatherings were presided over by Dalagastia. These 10 groups were constituted as follows. 1. The Council on Food and Material Welfare. This group was presided over by Ang. Food, water, clothes, and the material advancement of the human species were fostered by this able corps. They taught well digging, spring control, and irrigation. They taught those from the higher altitudes and from the north improved methods of treating skins for use as clothing, and weaving was later introduced by the teachers of art and science. Great advances were made in methods of food storage. Food was preserved by cooking, drying, and smoking. It thus became the earliest property. Man was taught to provide for the hazards of famine, which periodically decimated the world. 2. The Board of Animal Domestication and Utilization. This council was dedicated to the task of selecting and breeding those animals best adapted to help human beings in bearing burdens and transporting themselves, to supply food, and later on to be of service in the cultivation of the soil. This able corps was directed by Bon. Several types of useful animals, now extinct, were tamed together with some that have continued as domesticated animals to the present day. Man had long lived with the dog, and the blue man had already been successful in taming the elephant. The cow was so improved by careful breeding as to become a valuable source of food. Butter and cheese became common articles of human diet. Men were taught to use oxen for burden-bearing, but the horse was not domesticated until a later date. The members of this corps first taught men to use the wheel for the facilitation of traction. It was in these days that carrier pigeons were first used, being taken on long journeys for the purpose of sending messages or calls for help. Bond's group were successful in training the great fandors as passenger birds, but they became extinct more than 30,000 years ago. 3. The advisors regarding the conquest of predatory animals. It was not enough that early man should try to domesticate certain animals, but he must also learn how to protect himself from destruction by the remainder of the hostile animal world. This group was captained by Dan. The purpose of an ancient city wall was to protect against ferocious beasts, as well as to prevent surprise attacks by hostile humans. Those living without the walls and in the forest were dependent on tree dwellings, stone huts, and the maintenance of night fires. It was, therefore, very natural that these teachers should devote much time to instructing their pupils in the improvement of human dwellings. By employing improved techniques and by the use of traps, great progress was made in animal subjugation. 4. The faculty on dissemination and conservation of knowledge. This group organized and directed the purely educational endeavors of those early ages. It was presided over by